Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, Jay Chaudhary Garu, for inviting me to share my thoughts. Thanks a lot to KK for putting us together. It's indeed my privilege to be here sharing my thoughts. If India at 2047, India at 100, has to become a developed nation, then startups have to play a very, very critical role. And so it is my privilege to share what I see as the vision for India when it turns 100. I'll give you a little bit of background I'm going to be speaking based on my recently released book, India at 100. You can go and find it on Amazon, India @100, numbers 100. The subtitle of the book is Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse. I'll give you the bottom line. The bottom line may seem audacious, but hopefully in the next 15-20 minutes, I'll be able to explain to you the economic logic and the reasoning behind what I see this as the size of the Indian economy in 2047. I expect the Indian economy to be a $55 trillion economy in 2047. Now, that may seem audacious, and some of you may be wondering, whatever he had in the morning, whatever he smoked, I want a piece of that. It seems to be some cool stuff. Let me hopefully by the end of the talk, tell you that I'm absolutely sane. I've been very sane even while writing the book, and I've reflected a lot on this prediction, and with a lot of rigor and conceptual thinking and empirical evidence, data, I've actually come to this conclusion. So I'll explain to you why I think India can be a $55 trillion economy in 2047. But before that, let me share briefly the motivation for me to write this book. The motivation was a twofold one. First was a more prosaic motivation. When I was part of the government in 2021, the India at 75 activities were going on. And naturally, at that time, my thoughts went to how the economy will look when India turns 100. So that's where the thought for India at 100 got germinated. But a more powerful, compelling motivation was what I observed, inside out about a lot of the commentary on India, being part of the government. So I don't know how many of you might have noted, but I joined as the chief economic advisor in late 2018, in December of 2018. And the first press conference after the GDP numbers got released that I had to go and deal with, India's GDP growth had declined to 5.3%. Of course, we all know that the impact of policies in the past, things that have been going on manifest, and so. But I had to go and defend it, and at that time, I felt that there was a lot of negative commentary on India, on the Indian economy. In fact, even today, we find a lot of negative commentary on the Indian economy. For instance, there were people saying that there is something structurally wrong with the Indian economy. Hereafter, India will have to persist with only 5% or less growth. People even use terms that are actually loaded with religious overtones when giving labels to these growth episodes. And when COVID struck, then at that time in particular, many commentators actually took pleasure in talking and giving doomsday predictions about the Indian economy. So at that time, I actually felt, I had the privilege of being able to, in October of 2020, to make the prediction that the Indian economy will register a V-shaped recovery. And I'm glad that it happened. There was a good amount of judgment, of course, but there was a good amount of, credible hope with which one made that prediction, because I felt that at that point in time, it is important to actually display economic leadership. It's very easy to kick, whether it's an individual or an institution or the country, it's very easy to kick when someone is down, but it's far harder to actually lift that individual or the entity up and say a pat on the back and say, no, you can do it. And that's what, at that critical time, once in a century pandemic, that was what was required. But in this process, seeing so much of the negative commentary on India at that time, and even now, for instance, and by some people who have occupied very august offices, in the country, I got the feeling that it is important for positive thinking also to try and push back on a lot of the negativity that that a lot of commentators tend to actually enjoy enjoy encouraging. And in that context, I have actually come to now conclude that for positive outcomes to manifest, positive thinking is necessary, but for negative outcomes to manifest, negative thinking is sufficient. So if for negative outcomes to manifest, negative thinking is sufficient, but for positive outcomes, positive thinking is only necessary, then positive thinking has to work much harder compared to, to sort of counter the negativity. And, it is therefore, so the India at 100 book is essentially, it's a small, as we speak, if you think about that a yajna or a fire sacrifice, it's a small ahuti on my part to actually to generating that positivity, because there is a lot of positivity. There are lots of positives about the Indian economy, and that's what I want to share with you now. If India grows at 8% from here on till 2047, and there is a decent if to it. I'll come to that, why we can do it in a minute. If India grows at 8% in real terms, then the Indian economy can indeed become a $55 trillion economy. Now, before I give you the economics of how we grow at 8%, what are the other elements of that $55 trillion economy prediction, it is important to seek inspiration from other examples, other countries that have grown at similar paces. So let me give you the example of Japan. Japan from 1970 to 1995, this is a 25-year period, 1970 to 1995, grew its economy in dollar terms by almost 26 times, actually 25.6. And, in 1970, the Japanese economy, the GDP was about $220 billion in 1970. By 1995, 25 years later, the Japanese economy had reached $5.5 trillion. A multiplication of 25.6 times. Japan, as you know, is a democracy. If I give you the example of China, I will give you, but you might say, we can't compare with China because we are a democracy, China is not. And that's why I've given you the example of Japan, which was a democracy. Now, some of you may say that, that growth for Japan happened during a, honeymoon period for the global economy. The reality is it was not a honeymoon period at all. In fact, during 1970s to 1995, that was the period of the Vietnam War. That was the period of the oil shock. As a result of the oil shock, the US faced double-digit inflation. The entire Volcker phenomenon, the US has never faced that kind of inflation, since then. And interest rates went so high. Obviously, demand fell. So all these tailwinds, where all these headwinds were things that the Japanese actually had to encounter, and yet they grew from 220 billion to 5.5 trillion, growing their GDP 26 times. What I am estimating for India in the 25-year period is actually much less than that, about 15 times multiplication, not 25 times. So one of the main things actually I want to, want to emphasize is that we in India, especially as a country and as an individual itself, there are only two words that we need to keep saying, make it as a mantra: we can. We can. And I think that is the most important. If a Japan can, why cannot we? If a China can, and China actually, let me give you the example as well, from 1996 to 2021, the Chinese GDP grew 22 times in dollar terms. Now, of course, you'll say China is different, but I've already given you the example of a democratic nation, Japan, which grew its GDP. If Japan can, if China can also grow, its GDP over 20 times, why cannot we do that? We can as well. What is most important is for India to deliver GDP growth in real terms at 8%. Now, let me give you the sort of the number crunching behind this, economic number crunching, and then I'll give you some of the drivers why I think actually this is something that is possible. growth rate of GDP that has prevailed for India, is, from 1991 onwards, in real terms, our GDP has grown at about 7%. That's been the average GDP growth from 1991 onwards. So from 7% on average to 8% on average is a stretch goal, but it is not something that is actually, it is not, I'm not asking for a doubling of GDP growth. It's only a stretch goal. And we've grown at 7% during the last 30 years, despite, so many problems. We have a very slow judiciary. We have a bureaucracy that actually can improve significantly. We have our human capital, actually education levels can be much better. Poverty was much low, much higher during this 30-year period. Of course, it has declined. Abject poverty was also there. Despite that, we've grown at 7%. Lots of problems, lots of challenges, and yet we've grown. So 8% is a stretch goal, but we can do it. It's ambitious, but it is achievable. And I'll spend some time on what will be the key drivers for this later, but let me just focus on the numbers. So if we can grow at 8% with 5% inflation, that's been the average since the inflation targeting regime was implemented in 2016, where the central bank, Reserve Bank of India, has to actually, target inflation at 4%, has to deliver inflation at 4%. If you check the data from 2016 onwards, the average inflation has been 5%. So it's a very reasonable expectation, therefore, for me to say that going forward also, inflation will be 5% because Reserve Bank of India has to deliver inflation between 2% to 6%. So 4% plus minus 2. So 5% is at the higher end of that range. So 8% real growth, 5% inflation translates into 13% in nominal growth terms. 8 plus 5, 13%. Now, in order to estimate the growth that will happen in dollar terms, I have to also tell you what is the likely rate of depreciation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar that will prevail, going forward. And here, I'll first give you the number and then explain why I think that is something that will prevail. My estimation is that from here on, the rate of depreciation of the rupee would be less than 1%, 1% per annum. So it will depreciate by about, so maybe 50 basis points, 0.5%, maybe 0.6%, but less than 1% in a year. So with 13% in nominal rupee terms, 8% plus 5%, because depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms. So when you convert from rupee to dollar, actually depreciation reduces the value. So you have to subtract that 1% depreciation. 13 minus 1 is 12%. So 12% in dollar terms is what we get with 8% real growth, 5% inflation, and currency depreciation of about 1%. Let's use the rule of 72. This is something that all of us economists and people who actually work in markets as well use to know how many years it's going to take to double your money. The rule is very simple. 72 divided by the rate of interest that you get. You basically, whatever number you get, that's the number of years it will take to double your money. So remember, for instance, the time when national savings certificates actually used to double our money in 6 years. You remember that? It used to double our money because the rate of interest that was paid on that was 12%. So that's because 12 times 6 is 72, or 72 divided by 12 is 6 years. Similarly, growth at 12% in dollar terms will mean that GDP will double every 6 years. This is important. Keep in mind, GDP doubles every 6 years. Now, let's take the 24-year period from 2023 to 2047. If GDP doubles every 6 years over a 24-year period, how many doublings will happen? 4 doublings, right? 4 doublings, because 24 divided by 6 is 4. In other words, 2 into 2 into 2 into 2, 2 to the power 4, which is 16 times. So that's what I mentioned by actually saying that, we can multiply our GDP by about 15 to 16 times. So now let me tell you, in 2023, India's GDP was $3.28 trillion, approximated to 3.25. So the first doubling is 3.25 to 6.5. Second doubling is 6.5 to 13. Third doubling is 13 to 26. Fourth doubling is 26 to 52. 52. So 52 is close to that 55 trillion. I've not done an Excel calculation. I've just done a mental calculation with all of you, and we are close to that 55 trillion number. So the most important, aspect of this is 8% growth. Now let me spend a little bit of time explaining to you why I think that 1% depreciation of the rupee is what will prevail in the future. If you look at the data in the past, rupee has depreciated by about 3.5% per annum, 3 to 3.5% per annum. So compared to that, why do I think that the rate of depreciation will be lower, going forward? There's a very simple reason for that. If you look at the inflation that has prevailed in India from 1991 till 2016, when India implemented the inflation targeting regime, inflation was about 7.5% on average, during that period. But since then, from 2016 onwards, inflation has reduced to 5%. Now, one of the aspects of, when you think about international economics or, currency depreciation, it is that the currency that faces higher inflation has to experience higher depreciation. Why is that the case? Because if currency faces higher inflation, so, what does inflation mean? Today, what you can buy using 100 rupees, what you can buy using same 100 rupees next year is less. If, in real terms, actually your value of that 100 rupees is only 95 rupees next year if inflation is 5%. Similarly, if you take, let's say the US inflation has been about 2%. So in the US, $100 this year will be worth $98 next year. So in other words, the value of the dollar has not eroded as much as the value of the rupee has eroded. Now, when inflation was 7.5%, the value of the rupee was eroding much faster than that of the dollar than when inflation is 5%. So as a result, you actually have the currency having to depreciate more in order to keep the purchasing power the same. If you have to have actually the purchasing power of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar unchanged, then the rupee has to depreciate more in order for, basically 98 versus 95. So you can see 98 divided by 95, you see so that's the main reason. So when you have therefore a reduction in inflation, there'll be a concomitant decline in depreciation as well. So about 2.5% decline in the rate of inflation will translate 1-for-1 into a lower rate of depreciation. That's why instead of 3.5% rate of depreciation, about 1% is what we'll get. So that explains actually. So let me once again summarize quickly: 8% real growth, 5% inflation, 8 plus 5, 13. Subtract 1%, 12%. At 12%, GDP doubles every 6 years. 4 doubling, 16 times doubling. That's why from 3.28 to 55 trillion. Last, let me end with actually what are the key drivers for this 8% growth. I'll not elaborate too much, but let me just leave you with these 3 thoughts. One of the most important drivers of this 8% growth can be formalization of the economy. If you look at the Indian economy, it has been significantly informal. If you step out of the engineering staff college here, you go out, you'll actually find many people who sell idlis, let's say, on a shanty or some makeshift store. You'll find people who are selling dab, basically maybe on a thela kind of. They're all informal establishments. When these establishments become more formal, their productivity increases. And growth is essentially about 2 things, which is investment and productivity. How much investment you make, how productive is that investment. And when informal sector firms become formalized, when they become more formal, their productivity increases significantly. Because you can think about it, a store, somebody who's actually selling idlis, let's say using, doesn't even have a shop. If he's selling idlis, when he constructs a shop, he maybe has two people. The food that will be made actually will not get as much dust, etc., because it's covered, more hygienic, so he can, charge a higher price. If he has two more people to basically cook, he can actually sell more as well. So together he can sell more and charge a higher price. Obviously, for the same investment he's making in terms of his labor, in terms of its capital, he's reaping greater reward. So productivity increases. So this is something that economists, nobody quibbles about, which is the fact that formalization of the economy will increase productivity in the economy. Second is, even among the formal sector firms itself, Indian formal sector firms are still far behind their global peers, in terms of the productivity, and they will catch up, and they have been catching up over the last 3 decades, and especially over the last decade. For instance, if you latest, a couple of days back, the rankings came out. India is now ranked 39 in the global, innovation index. In 2015, India was ranked 85. from 85 to 39 in innovation. And by the way, this is not government data. This is data put out by this is a global innovation index. Actually, they put it out across all countries. So this is not, nobody can dismiss this as say, oh, I don't believe this data. This is actually, a global innovation index. Similarly, if you look at entrepreneurship, again, I'm giving you these statistics, using World Bank data. If you use World Bank data to look at new firm creation, from 2004 to 2014, the rate of growth of what we call CAGR, cumulative, annual growth rate of, for new firms from 2004 to 2014 was 3.2%. From 2014 onwards till 2023, new firm creation, the growth rate is 220%. 3.2% versus 220%, and this is basically startups. This is so relevant for this conference. Combination of innovation, combination of entrepreneurship, this is what will actually enhance productivity of our formal sector firms as well. That will be the second driver. Final, most important driver in my opinion, which is credit creation in the economy. Now, whenever credit is taken for creating assets, for instance, if I actually, when I started out, when I was in school, I used to drive a bicycle to school. Then, when I came to class 11, my father bought me a moped. So, to school, earlier it used to take me about 45 minutes of cycling to go to, with a moped, which was basically an asset. I was able to drive and, reach my school in 15 minutes. So I was saving time. My father didn't take a loan, but if he had taken a loan, for instance, that asset creation makes you more productive. That half an hour that I saved, actually, I could use it to study better. I was becoming more productive. This is true in general. When firms also, when they take on, loans for creating assets, they become more productive. And here the runway for India is significant, because if you look at credit creation in the economy, what proportion of GDP is basically being given as, how much credit is there as a percentage of GDP? If you take the rest of the world, for every 100 units of GDP, about 180 units of credit has been given in the economy. In contrast, if you take India, for every 100 units of GDP, only 58 units of credit has been given. So 58 versus 180. Think about the runway there is. Large sections of our population still remain unbanked. They don't get loans. They have brilliant ideas. They can actually go and create firms, but they don't get credit to be able to go and create. There's another aspect that is, very critical for the startup ecosystem. So from being able to grow from, with the current 58% levels to close to 150, 160%, there is huge opportunity. I'll give you a very specific example to illustrate what kind of power there is from credit creation. Take India and South Korea. India and South Korea in 1960. If you compare the data, in 1960, the credit creation percentage of GDP was 6% in South Korea, 8% in India. In other words, India was ahead of South Korea in 1960. Fast forward 60 years, in 2020, India's credit creation is 58%. South Korea is 180%, 178%. And that is why they actually have today, when we buy phones, we are buying Samsung phones instead of them, buying possibly our Jio phones. When we buy a car, maybe that's why we're buying Daewoo cars, and actually instead of them buying our Nano cars. So counterfactually, if you think about it, if this kind of credit creation had happened, for our manufacturing sector firms, for our export intensive sectors, it could have been the reverse, where we might have been exporting to them rather than importing from them. That shows the power of credit creation in the economy. Together, these three drivers itself, in the book, of course, I've covered many other aspects, judicial reform, bureaucratic reform, education, healthcare, digital economy, digitization, climate change, all these. I'm not getting into that for paucity of time, but just these three drivers themselves can push growth from what has been at 7% to 8% and thereby deliver the $55 trillion economy. To summarize, I'll leave you with this anecdote, hopefully an anchoring example that you can relate with. In India, Bollywood and cricket are actually religion. So I'll give you an example from cricket. In 1993, when Sachin Tendulkar had played cricket for a few years, it started playing cricket in 1989. At that time, Sunil Gavaskar assessed his potential. Based on his performance of 4 years, Sunil Gavaskar said that if he does not score at least 40 international hundreds and at least 15,000 international runs, I'll be very disappointed. In fact, he explicitly said, I'll go and strangle him myself. So that was it was a paternalistic statement assessing the potential. In a similar way, I have no pretensions of being, Sunil Gavaskar. I'm certainly not of cricket, not of economics either. But by looking at the potential, by looking at the performance of the Indian economy over the last 3 decades, in a similar way, I can assess that India offers the same potential as well to be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy in 2047. That's the second lesson from this example. Just because Sunil Gavaskar said it, Sachin Tendulkar did not score that 100 international hundreds and the 50,000, close to 30,000 international runs. He had to work very hard. He had to overcome setbacks. He had to actually, when he encountered challenges, he had to find innovative solutions. India will have to do that as well. In particular, state governments will have to do a lot of hard work, especially reforms. And I want to leave you with this particular message. Think about it. When the union budget is presented, all of us actually pay a lot of attention, ask a lot of questions to our finance minister, to the secretaries, etc. Do we ask similar questions to the state's finance minister, to the state secretary, about what reforms have you done? What are the reforms you've done for startups? What are the reforms you've done for enabling manufacturing? What are the reforms you've done for ease of doing business? What are the reforms you've done for enabling ease of doing business in our, these are questions that we need to be asking, because power and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. Whenever we look at narratives, especially when we look at the media, states only talk about their power, saying that center is infringing into this, infringing into that. When center oftentimes is having to actually do that because states are not doing it. So, when states start talking about their responsibility, then there would be no need for the union government to actually having to do these things. So the hard work that Sachin Tendulkar did today, that hard work has to be done by the state governments. And we as citizens have to do the hard work of putting pressure on them, asking them these same questions. And I'm hoping, therefore, next time when the Telangana state budget is presented or the Andhra Pradesh budget is presented, you all will ask the same questions of the state, chief minister and the state finance minister, and CIA and FICCI will actually, and ASSOCHAM and, all of you will organize sessions where you will basically unravel the state budget and say, hey, why didn't you do reforms? Show me my reforms actually on, what have you done on this? Ask those questions. Then you'll be doing your part of the work as well as citizens. Thank you very much.
To stay informed about the startup ecosystem, subscribe to My Startup TV.